Welcome back to the news today. This is One on One. Over the last several months, it's become apparent that Europe is at many different crossroads. On one hand, there's the issue of homegrown terror and how to contain it, coming to the forefront this past January with the attacks in Paris. On another is involvement in major negotiations over both the Ukraine crisis and an Iranian nuclear program. And then, of course, there's the economy, which, with the rise of anti-austerity movements, has become complex, to say the least. With me tonight to look at a bit of all of these is Dr. Esther Lopatin, Director of the Center for European Studies at the IDC Herzliya. Dr. Lopatin, good evening.
Good evening.
So I want to begin with sort of the crisis that has the faces of Europe out there more than any other right now, the crisis in eastern Ukraine. You have particularly Merkel and Hollande, very much public faces of the European response. Is Europe responding how it should to this crisis? Has it been for the last 9 months?
Well, I think it's interesting because in a way, like, I think that the EU has a share of its responsibility, like in this crisis, because in a way it could have been avoided. And what I mean is, like, if you put it in historical perspective, in 2013, Yanukovych, at the time the president of Ukraine, was about to sign a DCFTA agreement, Deep Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement, which is supposed to give like a free access to industrial goods from Ukraine to the EU without imposing tariff. It looks like
which
a great
was a major shift towards the EU for Ukraine.
And it looks like a great deal. The thing is that the Russians were terrified at the time, and at the last minute, Yanukovych changed its mind. The question is why the Russians actually were terrified, and they're still terrified from this agreement. If you look closely at the agreement, one of the things that it says there that Ukraine government is compelled actually to adopt EU standards and norms with regard to products. So it means, for example, like toys produced by Ukrainians supposed to follow the EU standards. They have to be safety, they have to be friendly to environment from certain materials, which means ultimately that most products that most products coming from Russia won't be qualified and meet those standards. And if we look at the amount of trade between Russia and Ukraine, we're talking about like 50% of the import for Ukraine comes from Russia.
Do you think it's more ideological or all about the economics? Is it a little of both? Russia's opposition, that is?
I think it's basically economically. I mean, like, Russians have been very clear on that this agreement is very detrimental for them, and they're going to lose economically, you know, from the deal. I think it was less ideological. It was more economic considerations, and I think in a way that it's pity because the European Union was supposed to be a better job, because the whole idea behind this agreement, because it was signed in the framework of ENP, European Neighborhood Policy. So the idea was to enhance, and I'm using the EU wording, to enhance stability and peace in Europe. And what we got...
That's clearly gone the other direction.
Exactly.
So I want to ask you then, you mentioned Russia and Ukraine and the clear economic interest, why Russia was against it, but you're saying that the EU is actually holds some responsibility. What could the EU have done differently?
That's a very good question. I think what the EU could have done at the time is, like, first, I mean, like, not to ignore Russia, because it seems that the EU is always like enlarging to the east, offering all kinds of association agreements to different countries in Eastern Europe, but they seem to ignore Russia. It's as if Russia is actually in a different planet.
Does Russia really need the attention? It seems like Vladimir Putin, he's all about the action and power, but you're saying even a little FaceTime, really, from the EU?
I think what they need is, like, it's not the attention. I think it's like the EU has to calculate what's supposed to be the impact of such an agreement on the trade between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, like, you know, to lose such a very important trading partner is very detrimental for the Russians, and I think that's something that I'm not saying that they should have. I think they should have discussed with the Russians. I'm not saying that they should accept everything the Russians are saying, but at least to understand the red lines and to understand the sensitivity.
So that's interesting. So if you're saying that initially that the EU sort of shut Russia out and that led us to where we are today, which is a very extreme crisis, over 5,300 people dead, the EU is sort of doing the same thing now in terms of shutting Russia out, and even more than that, putting heavy sanctions and further sanctions. So is the EU repeating its same mistake now? Are we headed to even more downhill than before?
To be honest with you, they're doing the same mistake, because what happened? Yanukovych fled to Russia, and in 2014, after a new government was established in Ukraine, EU actually offered the same agreement to Ukraine. So, and the European Parliament ratified the agreement in September 2014. And eventually, Russia said, you know, this agreement is unacceptable. So what happened? A few months ago, the EU agreed to suspend this agreement. But the whole idea was, from the first place, you know, what
Are they
really...
just afraid of Putin?
I think absolutely they're afraid of Putin. I mean, like, they were not afraid of Putin beforehand, because they clearly were not thinking about the implications of such an agreement. But I think for the moment, it's very clear that the German position and the French position is, you know, we don't want to get into a conflict with Russia. And what the Germans are saying, and also the French, saying the same thing, that let's find a diplomatic solution. And I think diplomatic solution would be eventually...
The famous diplomatic solution.
Yep.
On that note, I'd like to take it a little more internal Europe, because a lot is going on inside Europe, and you have what it looks like everything going to the extremes, at least from the outside. You have the radical left in Greece that just rose very swiftly to power, also in Spain. You have an extreme right National Front in France that's doing very well in the polls. Why is Europe going so extreme? How did it get there?
I think we already saw it, like, at the results of the European election in May 2014. It was very clear that there's an increased rise of the popularity of, I wouldn't call them right extremism, because in Britain, for example, UKIP doesn't qualify it as a right extremism. It's more like Eurosceptic parties. And now we see it also in Spain and in Greece. And what it means in a way...
You have a Europe full of parties that are doubting the very existence of the EU in the first place.
Absolutely. It's, in a way, it's a vote of no confidence in the European integration. And what people are saying is that we are disappointed from the European integration because we delegated too much power to institutions in key issues like migration, like economy, but the EU did not deliver. For example, in the question of migration, many Europeans fear that many migrants are still entering the EU, and especially from countries that associated with immigrants that might be problematic for the security.
And now with homegrown terror, it's a whole other level of a problem.
Absolutely. And with economic issues, like everyone seems to agree now in Europe that the monetary union that was created in 1992 and eventually with the whole currency, one currency was a failure because, if you look at unemployment rate in the Eurozone, it's higher than those countries who are not belong to Eurozone. Or like the national debt of, of most countries in the EU. It seems for many Europeans that it wasn't a good idea.
So I'm going to ask maybe a sort of provocative question. If the euro maybe was a failure and you have the rise of these parties, and you have a lot of Eurosceptic parties, was the EU itself, has it been a success or a failure?
I think it's a good question. I think to a large extent it has been a success because what was the major agenda of the EU or like European Economic Community was actually to resolve and to restore the relations between the two major rivalries in Europe, that is Germany and France. And I think in this way it was able to accomplish its mission because now like Germany and France are good friends, are great friends. So in this respect, exactly. Who would have thought like in the 50s or in the 60s, no one thought actually it's going to happen.
But are the two good friends enough to keep a 28-member bloc together?
It's a good question, what kind of friendship we have. And I think that what happened now with the Greek crisis, it shows that this solidarity sometimes, it could be, the glue is not, hard enough and it's to stick, to bind them. And it seems that there are problems, and we have to talk about them. But the major achievement definitely is to have peace between major European countries. So that's a major achievement. But I think the next test of Europe is like, are we going to maintain this European identity? What are we going to do if there's a crisis? How do we keep this glue, and how do we make sure that we...
Identity is obviously a huge part of it. In the very little time we have left, I want to take it then to terror, because we see Europe and France especially, again, wrestling with these questions of how do we deal with counter-terror, how do we deal with homegrown terror, a lot of very unclear answers. Is Europe, if it's so sort of fragmented as you describe, prepared in any way to deal with that threat?
That's interesting because they are fragmented when it comes to economic issues. Some countries, are in better position like Northern European countries than Southern European countries. But when it comes to how to deal with terrorism, I think there's a certain consensus in Europe, and many actually people in Europe, and we saw that with the Pegida movement, like in Germany, and also like in France. It seems like there's more and more feeling that there should be a kind of like Europeans should compromise on privacy rights. We haven't done it before, but now we have to make sure that, for example, we watch closely people who are suspected Islamists.
Right,
we watch closely.
Issues.
Exactly. So.
All right. Well, there are a whole lot of issues for Europe to deal with. It's interesting to see if it will remain fragmented or band together around issues like this. We'll see in the coming months, I'm sure. Dr. Esther Lopatin, thanks very much.
Thank you
for being with us. And that's it for us for tonight. Find us back here tomorrow night for another edition of the News Today from the Jaffa Port. Have a great night.